I always thought buying a fixer-upper would be a dream come true. You know, turning a worn-down, forgotten house into a cozy home, a place with history and character. When my husband, Nick, and I first set eyes on that old property at the edge of town, it was exactly what we'd been looking for. Sure, it needed work. Okay, a lot of work. But the bones were good, the price was right, and we were ready for the challenge. Or so we thought. What we didn't know then was that some things are forgotten for a reason. The house was old, built in the 1920s, with creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. It smelled like dust and mildew, but I loved it anyway. Every room felt like it had a story to tell, though not all of them, I'd soon learn, were stories you'd want to hear. The trouble started on a Saturday morning. Nick and I were working on the living room. Well, Nick was doing the heavy lifting, prying off the cracked wood paneling while I swept up the debris. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic thud of the crowbar hitting the wall. At one point, Nick stopped, standing there with the crowbar frozen midair. He called me over, saying there was something weird behind the paneling. I walked over, brushing sawdust off my jeans, and saw it too. A small steel door, embedded into the wall like a secret safe. It didn't look like it belonged there, not in a house this old. I asked if he thought it was locked. Nick shrugged, saying only one way to find out. He fiddled with the dial for a few minutes, but it wouldn't budge. I told him we should leave it for later, maybe call someone to crack it open properly. But Nick, being Nick, decided to borrow some tools from the garage. He said he'd get it open one way or another. I didn't love the idea, but I let him have his fun. It took him a good 20 minutes of grunting and cursing, but eventually, with one final shove, the door creaked open. The safe wasn't large, but it was deep, like a dark little cavern in the wall. Inside was a stack of old papers, some cash, mostly small bills, and a bundle of yellowed photographs wrapped in twine. The cash was exciting for all of 5 seconds, but it was the photographs that caught my attention. I untied the twine and flipped through the first few pictures. They were black and white, taken decades ago. The first couple were harmless. Shots of the house, some furniture, a few people standing in the front yard. But then the photos started to change. The people in them weren't smiling anymore. One showed a woman sitting in a chair, her face turned away from the camera. Another showed her again, but this time her wrists were tied to the armrests. I remember holding that photo, frozen, my hands trembling. I asked Nick if this was some kind of sick joke. He said he was just as freaked out as I was and asked if I thought the photos were taken in this house. I said they had to be. The wallpaper in the background of one of the photos was the same hideous floral print we just ripped off the walls. We sat there for a while, staring at the pictures, trying to make sense of them. Nick suggested we check the rest of the papers in the safe, see if they could tell us anything. Most of it was junk, old receipts, letters we couldn't quite decipher. But tucked in the back was something different. It was a set of police reports, faded but still legible. Nick read the first page out loud. It detailed an investigation into the house's former owner, a man named Henry Wallace. According to the report, he had been arrested in the late 1970s on suspicion of kidnapping, but the case fell apart due to lack of evidence. The victim had never been found, and Henry walked free. I asked Nick what kind of person could live in a house like this, surrounded by these secrets, and not go mad. He didn't answer. Instead, he suggested we call it a day and lock up the safe. I told him I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in the house anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind against the windows, felt heavier somehow, like the house itself was alive and watching. The next day, we decided to dig deeper into the property's history. We visited the local records office, where we found more reports about Henry Wallace. He'd lived alone in the house for decades, never married, never had kids. Neighbors had described him as quiet, polite, and unremarkable, except for the occasional odd behavior, like building a tall fence around the backyard or hauling in strange pieces of furniture late at night. One record mentioned that after his arrest, the police had searched the house but found nothing incriminating. No evidence, no victims, nothing. I asked Nick if he thought the police had missed something, if maybe there was more to the house than we'd realized. We returned to the house that afternoon, determined to search every inch of it. We tore up floorboards, checked behind vents, even looked under the basement stairs. But we didn't find anything, at least not at first. It wasn't until later that evening, when Nick was tearing out the last of the living room paneling, that we found something else. Wedged between the studs in the wall was a small wooden box. Inside was a single, crumpled piece of paper with one sentence scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. "You'll never find her." That was the last straw. I told Nick we couldn't stay there anymore, that I didn't care how much money we'd sunk into the renovations. The house wasn't a home. It was a graveyard of someone's secrets, and I wanted no part of it. We moved out 2 weeks later. The house still sits empty, just like we found it, with its hidden safe, its strange photographs, and its walls full of silence. Sometimes, I wonder what we might have found if we'd kept digging. Other times, I'm just glad we'll never know. I've always had a soft spot for old, abandoned buildings. There's something about the way they stand frozen in time, slowly being reclaimed by nature, that feels both eerie and fascinating. Maybe that's why, on a quiet Saturday morning, I found myself pulling up to an old farmhouse I'd spotted a few weeks back while driving through the countryside. The place was a cliché of rural decay, weathered with siding, broken windows, and a sagging roof that looked like it could collapse any second. But to me, it was a treasure trove of mystery. I parked my car just off the road, grabbed my flashlight, and told myself I'd just take a quick look around. The front door hung off its hinges, creaking as I nudged it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and damp wood. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the shattered windows, giving the whole place an almost dreamlike quality. The first floor was mostly empty, just a few broken chairs, a toppled-over table, and scraps of wallpaper peeling from the walls. But as I wandered into the kitchen, something caught my eye. On the far side of the room, there was a door, heavily bolted and chained. It stood out immediately. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a pantry or a storm shelter. But the more I stared at it, the more curious I became. Why go through so much trouble to keep it locked? I looked around and found a rusty crowbar lying near the sink. I figured I might as well see what was behind the door. It took a few minutes of prying, the chains rattling loudly in the silence, but eventually, the bolts gave way and the door creaked open. A narrow staircase led down into the basement, and a cold draft hit me from below. It smelled off, like damp earth mixed with something metallic. I hesitated. I'd already come this far, but a part of me felt like I was crossing some invisible line, like whatever was down there wasn't meant to be disturbed. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I switched on my flashlight and descended the stairs. The basement was bigger than I expected, with low ceilings and concrete floors. At first glance, it looked empty, just some old shelves and a pile of rotting wood in the corner. But as I walked further in, the beam of my flashlight landed on something that made my stomach drop. Cages. There were 3 of them lined up against the far wall. They were large, about the size of dog kennels, but reinforced with heavy metal bars. Nearby, chains hung from the walls, rusted and stained. My mind raced as I tried to piece it together. Were they for animals? But then why the chains? And then I saw the scratches. Long, deep gouges carved into the inside of the cages, like someone or something had been clawing to get out. I felt a wave of nausea. I told myself I needed to leave, that whatever this place was, it wasn't something I wanted to be a part of. I turned to head back upstairs when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of gravel outside. I froze, listening as the sound grew louder. Peeking through a small, grimy basement window, I saw headlights slicing through the early evening gloom. A car had pulled up to the house. 2 men stepped out, both wearing baseball caps and work boots. They looked like they belonged here, and the way they moved, purposeful, confident, made it clear they weren't just passing through. I felt my heart start to race. I was trespassing, and if they caught me, I didn't think I'd get off with just a warning. I darted up the stairs as quietly as I could, my mind racing for a place to hide. The sound of the front door creaking open sent a jolt of panic through me. I slipped into the nearest closet, pulling the door shut just as footsteps echoed through the house. The men were talking, their voices low and muffled. I pressed my ear to the crack in the closet door, straining to make out their words. One of them mentioned something about needing to clean up before the police came snooping again. The other said something about the basement and evidence. I held my breath as their footsteps grew louder, moving toward the kitchen, toward the basement door. One of them muttered something about the chains being off, and I realized they must have noticed I'd been down there. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard one of them swear under his breath. He said they couldn't afford another slip-up, not after what happened last time. I didn't want to know what last time was. I waited until their voices faded, then slowly cracked the closet door open. They were in the basement now, their flashlights bouncing off the walls as they moved through the room. This was my chance. I slipped out of the closet and crept toward the front door, keeping low and moving as quickly as I could. Every creak of the floorboards felt deafening, but somehow, I made it outside. I didn't stop to look back. I sprinted to my car, my heart pounding in my chest, and drove off as fast as I could. I don't know what those men were cleaning up, and I don't want to know. Whatever that farmhouse was, whatever happened there, it wasn't something I was meant to uncover. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those cages, about the scratches, and I wonder who or what was trying to get out. If you're drawn to tales like these, consider subscribing to Spectral for more chilling entries waiting to be uncovered. And if you have your own haunting story that you'd like featured in an upcoming compilation, we'd love to hear it. Just email us at spectralentries@gmail.com. Now, let's get back to the video. When I first moved into Maple Hollow, I thought I'd found a slice of suburban paradise. The streets were lined with neat rows of trees, the lawns were perfectly trimmed, and the neighbors were polite without being overbearing. It was exactly the quiet life I'd been looking for after years of city chaos. But there was one thing that didn't fit: the house across the street. It was a two-story home, faded and sagging, its windows covered in grime and curtains drawn tight. The lawn was overgrown, and the mailbox leaned at an awkward angle. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. Every other house on the street looked picture-perfect, so the sight of this rotting relic was jarring. I couldn't stop looking at it. On my second day, I struck up a conversation with my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, while she was watering her garden. She was an older woman, sharp-eyed and sprightly, and seemed to know everything about the neighborhood. I gestured toward the house across the street and asked her who owned it. Her smile faded instantly. She told me not to worry about it, that it was just one of those places better left alone. She said kids used to dare each other to break in, but nobody did anymore, not after what happened a few years back. When I asked what exactly had happened, she shook her head and told me to drop it. Of course, I couldn't. By the end of my first week, the house had become an obsession. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself staring at it, wondering what was inside. I told myself it was harmless curiosity, that I just wanted to see if there was some kind of historical significance. One evening, I decided to stop wondering and find out for myself. It was just after midnight when I crossed the street, flashlight in hand. The neighborhood was quiet except for the occasional chirp of crickets. As I approached the house, a chill ran down my spine. The air felt heavier somehow, and the closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. The front door was unlocked, the wood soft and splintered as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell hit me first, a damp, musty stench like something rotting. My flashlight swept across the room, revealing broken furniture, graffiti scrawled on the walls, and piles of debris scattered across the floor. It looked like the house had been abandoned mid-collapse. I wandered from room to room, my footsteps echoing on the warped floorboards. There was something off about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air felt too still, too quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath. That's when I found the photographs. They were scattered across a table in what used to be the living room. Black and white pictures, most of them creased and faded with age. They showed families standing on porches, kids playing in yards, couples posing in front of cars. At first glance, they seemed harmless, just old memories left behind. But then I looked closer. The people in the pictures looked familiar, too familiar. One photograph showed a man grilling in his backyard. I recognized the fence behind him. It was Mrs. Callahan's. Another showed a family standing in front of a house down the street, the same house where a young couple lived now. I flipped through picture after picture, my stomach churning. These weren't random strangers. They were people who lived in the neighborhood, and they looked exactly the same as they did now. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. None of it made sense. If these photos were as old as they seemed, how could the people in them look unchanged? I didn't have time to think. A noise upstairs, a creak, soft but unmistakable, made my blood run cold. I wasn't alone. I turned off the flashlight and held my breath, straining to hear. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moved across the ceiling. They stopped directly above me. I bolted for the door, not caring about stealth anymore, and ran back to my house without looking back. The next morning, I showed Mrs. Callahan one of the photographs. She went pale the moment she saw it. She told me the people in the picture were the Johnsons, who had lived 3 doors down until they disappeared 20 years ago. She said no one ever figured out what happened to them. They just vanished one night, leaving everything behind. When I told her about the other photos, her expression darkened. She said there had been more disappearances over the years than anyone cared to admit. Families would move into the neighborhood, live here for a while, and then one day they'd be gone. No warnings, no goodbyes, just gone. And somehow all their faces ended up in that house. I haven't gone back since. I don't want to know what's in that house or what was walking around upstairs that night. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I catch myself staring at it through my bedroom window. The curtains are always drawn, but sometimes I swear I see them move, just a little, as if someone is peeking out, watching.